Please join me in the prayer of illumination. Draw close to us, Holy Spirit. Silence our agendas. Exile our assumptions. Banish our casual indifference. Clear the cobwebs from our ears, O Lord, and pierce our hearts with your holy word. Amen. The first reading is from James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambitions in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace.
The first 8 chapters of Mark's gospel are an invitation to a secret, that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, is indeed the long-awaited Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the one who was promised in the Old Testament. Last week at the end of chapter 8, we heard Peter's dramatic confession, the unveiling of this secret publicly for the first time in the gospel, where Peter proclaims that Jesus is indeed the Christ, the Messiah. In response, though, Jesus demands that his disciples remain silent. He then invites them to follow him on the way, which is what the early church was known as, the way, this path of discipleship. And he says it's going to be a difficult road, because Jesus said he is going to Jerusalem, and there he will suffer. He will be persecuted. He will be put to death. But ultimately, he will rise again on the third day. And so chapters 9 through 16, the whole rest of the gospel, are the unfolding of these words that Jesus proclaims. And they give us a hint of the kind of Messiah that Jesus will be, which is very different from what was expected and what the disciples certainly were looking for. Jesus said he is going to be a servant rather than a warrior, that he is, in fact, going to be among the least, not among the greatest, and that he will not be the first, but he will be the last, and he will be a servant of all. Now, when we read Mark's gospel, every story seems to have behind it a question. You hear the narrative asking us, do you understand what is going on? Are you prepared to follow Jesus now that you've heard his latest teaching? Are you really in the know? And we hear it quite explicitly in our reading this morning. So I want us to have those questions in mind as I read from chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. Do we get the point? Do we truly understand what Jesus is saying as he speaks to his disciples on the way? Jesus and his disciples went on from there, and they passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But the disciples did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when Jesus was in the house, he asked his disciples, "What were you arguing about on the way. But the disciples were silent, for on the way they had argued about which one of them was going to be the greatest. And Jesus sat down and he called his 12 to him and he said this, "Whoever wants to be the first must be the last of all and servant of all." And then he took a little child and put the child among them. And taking the child into his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that the first hymn this morning we're going to look at a little bit more deeply. And in some ways, it is an unusual hymn to open a service with. Usually we have more of a praise-style hymn. This one may be more something we would expect to hear in the season of Lent. But I chose it. I can't blame Karen for this one. This was my choice to start the service this morning. She usually does a wonderful job of choosing appropriate hymns for our service. But I chose it specifically because I think it helps both to look back to last week's reading in Mark chapter 8 and invites us into the gospel reading for this morning. Because you may recall back in chapter 8 with Peter's confession, Jesus immediately responds by inviting his disciples and all of his followers to take up the cross and follow him. Now, the four stanzas that we sang already a little bit earlier, I think, are a wonderful way to explore what that means to follow, to take up our cross. And most modern hymnals have those four stanzas in them. But I discovered this week that there is, in fact, a fifth stanza that is occasionally included in hymnals, but mostly is not. And so that's what I included in the bulletin this morning. So if you want to take out your bulletin for a moment and take a look, and those who are watching will see it up on the screen at home. Now, I'm going to be kind to you this morning, and I'm not going to sing this, but I want us to look at it. And the hymn writer says this, "Take up your cross and follow Christ, nor think till death to lay it down. For only those who bear the cross may hope to wear the glorious crown." Now, I thought about that term, that image this week as we read again from Mark's gospel. In particular, the last image that is mentioned there, may hope to wear the glorious crown. And to me, that seemed very much different than taking up a cross in the thought of wearing a crown. But I think that image is at the heart of our reading this morning. And I think it's also at the heart of Jesus' call to follow him, even on this dark and dangerous road to Jerusalem. Because I think as they were on the way, as they were walking along with Jesus, as they're now making their way to Jerusalem, I think the disciples were wondering what kind of glorious crown were they seeking? What kind of glorious crown might they receive as they argued about who was going to be the greatest among them? So this morning, I want us to begin by thinking for a moment, using our imaginations a little. Imagine the image of a crown. What comes to mind when you think about that word? Perhaps it's an image of kings and queens. People maybe in rich, flowing robes in a big palace with hundreds of attendants around them wearing the crown of glory. And in fact, we can use the term the crown to refer to the monarchy. It's something that's synonymous with kings and queens in power. But of course, the word crown also has a deeper meaning. A crown is something that signifies completeness. After all, a king or a queen finally receives their crown at their coronation. It signals that they have officially come into power, and they receive the crown as the very last point in that process. And so the crown is the last thing that they put on. It's something that symbolizes the final step in their ascension to the throne. And of course, throughout history, we have also used that term and that image. We think about athletes who often receive a crown or a crown of a glory when they succeed and they have victory. And of course, we use it in our common everyday language. We speak of crowning glory or a crowning achievement as something that is recognized and is a final victory. May we hope to wear the glorious crown, the hymn writer says. And I thought about that phrase again and again this week. And I realized that often we spend much of our human lives trying to achieve some kind of crown or other. Maybe it's with people or with relationships that promise to make us whole and complete, that we grasp and reach for. Maybe it's other things, public acclaim or positions of power that signify success and victory. And so I think in this morning's reading, there's some very human questions behind our story. What kind of crown are we seeking after? What kind of crown do each of us desire? Do we seek this glorious crown that Jesus is offering to us on the way? Or is there another kind of crown that we most deeply desire? Now, I don't imagine that any of us woke up this morning thinking about glorious crowns. And yet, each day we strive for something. There's something that we look for and desire. There's some purpose deep within our lives that drives us. Every day, there's something behind the decisions that we make, the places we go, the priorities that we set. Maybe it's ambition. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's just survival. Or maybe it's compassion and mercy and desire to live out our faith. But I think no matter what that might be, what we all have in common is that we are seeking after something. Something to give us completeness. Something to bring meaning to our lives. And I think it's that human trait that Jesus taps into this morning in our reading from Mark chapter 9. So when we join the story today in chapter 9, that desire finally comes to the surface as Jesus is making his way back towards Galilee. Jesus lays out here for the second time very clearly the kind of crown that he is offering. Again, he said this, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." Now remember, Mark is always asking that question, do we understand what Jesus is saying? And the next verse makes very clear that the disciples do not understand. In fact, it says they're even afraid to ask Jesus what exactly this means. And so when they arrive back in Capernaum, remember this is back in the hometown, the familiar territory, Jesus takes them alone inside the house. And then he asks that hard question of them. He says, "What were you talking about? What were you discussing there on the road, on the way, as we came together?" And of course, what follows is an embarrassing silence. Because the 12 know that they have been caught. That what they were talking about, what they were discussing, is not something they want to reveal to Jesus. And I think that's because the disciples had a very different crown in mind as they made their way to Jerusalem. After all, they were seeking a popular and powerful Messiah, which was the common image of the day. They wanted one who was going to overthrow their oppressors, one who was going to come in power and therefore also install them in places of power. That's what they were seeking and looking for. For them, completeness meant power and prestige, honor and status. But that, of course, is not what Jesus desired. The late Henry Nouwen called this misunderstanding here the temptation of power. And this is what he writes. He says, power offers an easy substitute for the hard task of love. It seems easier to be God than to love God. It's easier to control people than to love people. And it's easier to own life than to love life. Jesus says, do you love me? And we ask, like the disciples in the story today, can we sit at a place of honor and be the one who has the greatness? The long, painful history of the church, Nouwen says, is unfortunately the history of a people who ever and again are tempted to choose power over love, control over the cross, and being leaders over being led. I think this story reveals this much, that the kind of crown that we desire and seek after deeply influences how we see the world, how we see other people, and what we desire for ourselves. The disciples' crown of power and glory sees the world as a place to control and to manipulate. It is a view from the top down. And people are valued in this kind of world for what they can do for us in our climb to victory. The glorious crown of Jesus, though, offers a very different view of our world. Jesus says it's a place of sacrifice and love and service. It is a view much more from the bottom looking up, where people are valued not for what they can do for us, but rather, Jesus said, how we can serve them. That is the most important trait. And of course, this difference in the worldview and the types of crown becomes crystal clear when Jesus enacts a parable right in their midst. He takes a young child and brings it into their midst. Now, it's important to remember that in the ancient culture of Jesus' time, children had little or no status. They didn't have the sentimental value that we often put on children in our modern times. Children, in fact, were subject to the authority of their fathers. They're viewed really as little more than property. And in fact, in some cultures, infants were even abandoned, left to be found by others. So when Jesus brings a child in, he's not trying to be sentimental, but he's saying, here's the one that has no power and no status, no honor, and no glory. And he said, what will you do with this child? This one who has little worth in the world. In the kingdom that I am proclaiming, Jesus says, in the crown that I am offering, this child is embraced and loved and cared for and lifted up. In fact, he goes even further where he says, the one who welcomes such a child welcomes me, Jesus said. And when you welcome me, you welcome the one who sent me. In other words, Jesus makes a direct link between the welcoming of the child of the lowliest of status and one's welcome for God. Those two cannot be separated, that they speak to one another and reflect one another. Welcome, Jesus says, welcome the least of these, because in doing so, that is how the glorious crown is revealed to you. And so it is on the way, as the disciples are making their way on the path of faith, that we discover that a major part of being a follower of Jesus, of living the Christian life, is taking off and setting aside that crown that we so deeply desire and taking up the one that Jesus offers. It's about, as Jesus said, moving from first to last and being a servant of all. That's when we begin to understand what Jesus is talking about. And in some ways, that same understanding was very clearly reflected in the reading from James that Meg shared with us just a few moments ago. Here's what James said a couple generations after Jesus' life to his community. He says, "Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom, pure and peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace." James is speaking directly to those who would put on that glorious crown that Jesus offers. Let me close with a brief story, an illustration that I've told before. It's a story about an abbot of a well-known monastery. And he went to a holy man, a hermit, seeking his advice, because the once great community that he had led had fallen on hard times. People were no longer flocking to the monastery. The monks who lived there seemed to be in conflict, constantly arguing with one another. They had little joy in their hearts and seemed always at one another's throats. So the abbot asked the holy man, he said, "Is this all happening because of some sin of ours at the monastery? Is that why we've been reduced to this kind of state? Have we done something wrong?" "Yes," the holy man replied, "it is the sin of ignorance." "Ignorance," the abbot said, "what kind of sin might that be?" "Well," the holy man said, "one of the members of your community is the Messiah in disguise, but you are ignorant of this." On his long journey back home, the abbot began to become excited about the possibilities. The thought that the Messiah was living among them, had returned to earth and was right there, and yet they had not yet recognized him. And so when he got back to the monastery, he called all his brother monks in together. And he told them the news that he had received, that the Messiah was there among them, but not recognized. Of course, they began to look around at one another in disbelief. The Messiah here? That's just incredible. But they weren't able to recognize him. So maybe it was Brother Cook who provided for their meals each day, or maybe it was Brother Pryor, or maybe one of the new members, the new brothers who had just arrived a few years before, or maybe someone else who was right there in the room with them. One thing was for certain, though, that because the Messiah was in disguise, they would not recognize him. And so the monks began to see each other very differently. They began to treat one another with respect and consideration and love, because indeed, that may be the Messiah who they were together with. You never know, they said, each one of our brothers might be the Messiah. And so the result was that the spirit of the community changed completely. They were now filled with a vibrant joy and care and respect for one another. And that love and that joy overflowed, and soon people began to flock back to the monastery for the holy and joyful words and music of the monks was filled now with the spirit of love. It's a glorious crown, Jesus says. It is offered to those who will not be first, but will be last, and will be servant of all. And so, friends, what kind of crown do we seek after? And as we do that seeking, my prayer is that the Lord blesses us with the privilege and the ability to look more deeply than the surface of those around us, and to live out the glorious crown that we have been given. To God be all praise and honor and glory this day.